the word vision has become one of the most frequent words in the English language. I think it's incumbent on every journalist who's commenting on the administration and its activities to throw the word vision in at least 3 or 4 times, usually with the adjective grand or something in front of it. It's true that every president has to come along with a vision. That's part of the tools of the trade. But this one has really reached a peak of exuberance and exposure that goes a bit beyond the norm. Well, the vision was announced. There were 2 phases to it. There was an announcement and then the achievement to bring the announcement to reality. The announcement was in the last couple of days of September. There were 3 or 4 days there where there was a series of speeches by the President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Ambassador to the UN, all of which presented the Clinton vision of foreign policy. And then in the following months, particularly in November, came the realization of the vision, both foreign and domestic, first with the passage of what is misleadingly called the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's not totally misleading. It does have to do with North America. So that version of NAFTA was the major achievement. That was followed immediately by an anti-crime bill and by the triumph at the Asian Pacific Summit out in Seattle. That's what I want to talk about, the vision, the announcement, the achievement, and I think the easiest way to do it is to kind of unravel it backwards. So let's start with the end, with the Asia-Pacific meeting in Seattle, where the vision was finally consummated. With great praise, I should say. There was much swooning over the grand vision, the greatest rethinking of U.S. policy toward Asia in half a century. Headlines like Clinton preaches open markets at summit, which was quite true. He did preach open markets at the summit. The performance came to its peak with a major speech that Clinton delivered, in which he spoke at a corporation in the buildings of a corporation, which he designated as the model for his vision of the free market future for Asia. The corporation was the Boeing Corporation. He spoke in a hangar there and pointed out accurately that Boeing is the leading U.S. exporter. In fact, he could have gone on to say that civilian aircraft are the leading U.S. export manufactured item, $18 billion a year or 2 ago. He could have gone on to add further that the real U.S. comparative advantage in world trade these days is shifting from manufacturing to what are called services, and about 1/3 of the export surplus is aircraft related, meaning tourism and that sort of thing. So it was a wise choice. That's the model that the free market vision for the future should copy. There are, of course, a few questions that could be raised. The idea of selecting Boeing aircraft as the model for a free market future does perhaps arouse a slight bit of puzzlement. Boeing, as is well known, is a publicly subsidized corporation. It is a private corporation, meaning the profit is private, but the public pays for it. Boeing wouldn't exist if it weren't for an enormous public subsidy that comes through the Pentagon and through NASA and so on. When you fly a Boeing airplane, as I did this morning, you're flying a modified bomber. The technology and the research and the development and the avionics and everything else were paid for by the public, including the Boeing workers. And if indeed civilian aircraft is our major manufacturing export, and if tourism-related services are our major service export. That simply shows extensive public subsidy in which public funds are provided to what's called private enterprise for them to use to maximize the profit of their investors and owners and CEOs and so on. That's the model for the future. Actually, for the free market future. If you look a little beyond into the small print in the laudatory articles, you'll find that the decision of the Boeing executives these days is to carry out what the press what the New York Times, I'm quoting, calls job-creating investment. So that's nice. We want to create jobs with the funds that you give them, except that those jobs are going to be created overseas because it's much more profitable that way. And as the Times put it, this is being done on a scale which would make the harshest critic of NAFTA wince if they knew about it. But fortunately, the people who are paying the bills, including the Boeing workers, aren't supposed to know about it unless they got to paragraph, 83 of the relevant article in the New York Times. Well, that's the model. That's the major model for the free market future for Asia. There was another one. Clinton announced that he had made a deal with China by which China would be provided with supercomputers from the Cray Corporation. And that's another model for the free market future that we're cheering about. Well, of course, Cray Supercomputers is another corporation that's publicly subsidized. The offer to China is itself kind of interesting. It was announced at the summit, simultaneously with the summit, that China would be provided not only with supercomputers, but also with U.S. Products that can be used for nuclear power generation, generators for nuclear power plants from GE and so on, and also other high technology exports. These are being offered to China in violation of recent congressional legislation, which bans export of high technology materials to China after Congress was informed by the intelligence system, apparently conclusively, that China was involved in proliferation of missiles in violation of international conventions, and probably nuclear weapons proliferation as well. Well, according to the Clinton administration, the supercomputers are going to be used for weather forecasting. But Pentagon analysts quickly pointed out that nobody's going to know whether they're used for weather forecasting. The same computers can be used for missile development. The transfer of technology from nuclear power generation to nuclear weapons is a very small one. So there's a strong chance, in fact, a likelihood, that the Clinton administration is now engaged directly in technology transfer, which will contribute to further nuclear proliferation and missile proliferation in violation of international conventions. So our commitment, let's say simply to summarize, our commitment to the free market is illustrated by the examples of our commitment to the free market vision of the future are state subsidized, meaning publicly subsidized, private profit corporations, where the management, which of course has the right to do this in our system, carries out job enhancement programs elsewhere, dispersing public funds to eliminate the jobs of US workers, because that's the way you can be more profitable. Our commitment to human rights and non-proliferation is illustrated by high-tech exports to major human rights violators who were involved in missile and nuclear proliferation. Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, explained the matter of the congressional legislation which bans what they were doing by saying that by explaining to the Chinese that the administration would interpret the congressional legislation banning export of high technology, of high-tech equipment to China. They would interpret it as permitting such export, so that took care of that problem. Now, intellectuals have a kind of a task at this point. They have to portray all of this as a triumph of our commitment to the free market and to human rights and to democracy. And intellectuals on the left, or on the left liberal side of the spectrum, also have a task. They have to portray it all as a demonstration of how what's called these days the politics of meaning guides every thought of the Clintons. And you want to make sure that you understand these instructions properly. Well, that was the apogee. That was the peak of the grand achievements, the Seattle Summit. Let's go back to the one that immediately preceded it. The one that immediately preceded it was the passage of NAFTA, the executive version of NAFTA, in mid-November. What was going on right at that period, right before the House vote and right after it, is extremely interesting and revealing. There was a kind of crescendo of hysteria building up among political leaders and in the press, which is a little bit unusual. Usually the political leaders and the press commentators try to repress their class loyalties. They don't want them to be too much on the surface. They try to take a pose of being above the fray. But this time that didn't happen. It all came out in the open. Actually, the New York Times even used the phrase class lines. I don't think I've ever seen that before in the press. It's one of the things we're not supposed to say. Too much was at stake, and it was impossible to keep it quiet. In the days before the vote, days immediately before the vote, you recall that Clinton was speaking publicly about, I'll quote his words, the real roughshod, muscle-bound tactics of organized labor. The raw muscle, the sort of naked pressure that the labor forces have put on, involving pleading based on friendship and threatening based on money and work in the campaign when they approach their elected representatives. You obviously never see a corporate lobbyist sinking that low. There were front-page stories which featured the president's call to Congress to resist the hardball politics of the powerful labor interests. Business was reeling from the onslaught, could barely face the terror of the mob. Anthony Lewis wrote at the far left, wrote an article in which he denounced the labor movement as backward and unenlightened. The crude, threatening tactics used by unions to make Democratic members of the House vote against NAFTA underline that point. Labor was driven by fear of change and fear of foreigners, really dangerous people. The Times had an editorial the day right before the vote, listing that little box in the editorial, listing the representatives from the New York area who had announced they were going to vote against NAFTA, and next to every one of them, they listed the amount of the contributions they had received from labor in their last political campaign, and the Times pointed out that that's rather ominous. It's an unsettling pattern. It indicates that maybe these people aren't voting their consciences, but are just being threatened by the crude, threatening tactics and the raw muscle of labor. Well, as a number of the aggrieved representatives later pointed out, the Times had not listed corporate contributions to representatives, nor for that matter had it listed attitudes of Times advertisers towards NAFTA and asked whether that suggests an unsettling pattern about their enthusiastic support for it. But to criticize the press for this is a little bit unfair for several reasons. For one thing, it's kind of unnecessary to point out, to discuss corporate contributions. That's like reporting on the fact that you breathe air when you walk around. I mean, if that's the way the country's supposed to run. It's supposed to be run by powerful business interests. That's taken for granted. So it's no threat to functioning democracy if corporate lobbyists twist people's arms and pour huge amounts of money into the campaign and so on. That's just the way it's supposed to work. It's when labor tries to get involved. It's when working people try to become involved in influencing legislation that there's a real threat to democracy, and you have to get hysterical about it. Furthermore, it's, again, unfair to criticize the Times for not pointing this out, because they did indeed have a front-page story comparing labor lobbying with corporate lobbying. in which the reporter Michael Wines accurately pointed out that there was just no comparison. I mean, corporate lobbyists were in, fancy suites right next to the House floor with all kind of, fancy telephones and appurtenances and celebrities all over the place. Labor, they said you could find, a couple of blocks down the road in a boiler room somewhere without any telephones and, so on. They quoted one corporate lobbyist who was in the Carter administration is looking at this and saying it's going to be a complete blowout. There's no worry about it. So they did tell the story accurately. There was a slight problem. The story was published the day after the vote. But again, it's unfair to criticize them for that. The newsroom is a busy place and things sometimes fall between the cracks, and so on. But what's interesting about the hysteria, and it was real hysteria, I mean, the examples that I cited are illustrative, is that it illustrates that the traditional hatred for democracy among privileged elites, which is, after all, not very surprising because democracy would threaten privilege, that this is not just hatred of democracy, but it's passionate hatred of democracy. If the mob, the rabble, ever begins to become involved in something like requesting that their representatives do something, the civilization is coming to an end. It's not just a small problem from the point of view of a spectrum of opinion running from, say, Anthony Lewis over to the right, but it's a major problem. In fact, it's a catastrophe. That reflects hatred of democracy, which is true passion. And again, it won't surprise anyone who's familiar with intellectual history. If you go back to the 17th century, first modern democratic revolutions in the 17th century in England, and you look at the way, the privileged classes and the educated were responding to efforts of the rabble to become involved in the political process, the hysteria was very similar. In fact, nothing has changed since those days, except that now it's rarely necessary to rise to these heights because usually the mob is kept under better control. The people who Walter Lippmann once called the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, meaning the general population, generally don't intrude where they don't belong, like in the political arena. But when they do, you really have to beat them down because otherwise we're in bad trouble. Well, Clinton's performance on the NAFTA issue, again, won great praise. There was another front page article in the New York Times the day the vote passed by their Washington correspondent, R.W. Apple, in which I can't duplicate this, so I'll quote it for you. He said, "Mr. Clinton retreated early on Bosnia, on Haiti, on homosexuals in the military, on important elements of his economic plan." That's a reference to the tiny stimulative package. "He seemed ready to compromise on all but the most basic elements of his healthcare reforms. Critics asked whether he had a bottom line on anything. On NAFTA, he did, and that question won't be asked for a while." In other words, he silenced his detractors. When it's simply a matter of the lives of millions of people, our man is pragmatic and knows how to give up. But when it comes to the call to responding to the call of business power, he showed he really has backbone after all. So there is a bottom line, and our hero is a man of principle, as we had hoped. Well, that's again a natural reaction to a conflict where a great deal was perceived to be at stake. And it's interesting to ask exactly what was perceived to be at stake that caused this hysterical reaction in which class loyalties were expressed with such complete candor and, in fact, fanaticism. Another article that appeared in the New York Times the day after the vote, that seems like one of my favorite issues of the New York Times, that day after the vote. There was another one which gave the first analysis that the Times had presented of what the economic effects of the NAFTA agreement were likely to be for the New York region. And it spelled them out. Well, let me see if I got it here. It said that there would be many gainers. The gainers would be sectors based in and around finance, the region's banking, telecommunications, and service firms, insurance companies, investment houses, corporate law firms, the PR industry, a vast assortment of such professional service firms from management, consultants, and public relations to law and marketing. They're all poised to seek new businesses in Mexico. Banks and Wall Street securities firms, which would probably draw more benefit from the pact than any other businesses, say they're itching to buy Mexican businesses or invest in them. Some manufacturers would gain, namely high-tech industry and pharmaceuticals, both of which would benefit, they didn't mention this, but I add, would benefit from the increased protection. This version of NAFTA is highly protectionist, which is why American corporations liked it so much. And a major part of that was increased protection for patents and what's called intellectual property, generally provisions that are designed to ensure that the technology of the future and the products of the future will be monopolized by US-based transnational corporations. In addition, they said two of the region's two largest manufacturing industries would benefit, namely the capital-intensive chemical industry, not many workers there, so they'll benefit, and publishing. Well, they'll of course benefit from the highly protectionist measures that are being added. Publishing doesn't refer to Covered Action Quarterly and Lies of Our Times, but to the enormous propaganda apparatus run by the corporate system, which will indeed benefit. Incidentally, that they didn't ask whether that raises some ominous questions about the Times editorial position, but I'll put that one aside. They also mentioned, there's a couple of sentences scattered in the article that says, well, you know, it's not perfect. There's going to be a few losers, too. Here's the losers. Predominantly women, blacks, and Hispanics, and semi-skilled production workers, which means about 3/4 of the workforce. So in other words, it's not perfect, you know, but basically pretty good. Going back to Anthony Lewis and labor being driven by fear of foreigners and fear of change and being unenlightened, I mean, looking at the predictions, one can perhaps draw some other conclusions. I should say that these analyses of the effects of NAFTA are quite general across the board. If you look at economists who supported it, which is almost all of them, and the few who questioned it, they do agree on some things. They agree that it will have the effect of increasing the polarization of the society. That means the benefits from NAFTA will be highly concentrated in wealthy sectors, the kind that the Times listed. And the costs of NAFTA, this version of NAFTA, will, in fact, it's designed for this purpose. You could imagine other NAFTAs, but this NAFTA was designed so that the costs will spread over the whole population, who will probably suffer an absolute decline from it. So one of the most highly regarded analyses by a professor at UCLA estimates that by the end of the decade, this version, he, I think, is in favor of NAFTA, that by the end of the decade, this version of NAFTA will add about $3,000 annual income to sectors of the kind that the Times listed among the gainers, and it will lead to about a $700 a year annual decline, absolute decline in real income for the losers that the Times indicated, the workforce by and large. And that'll average out, he estimated, to a loss for the general population of about $200 a year in real income by the end of the decade. Well, exactly what effect NAFTA will have on job flow is kind of hard to estimate. Those are sort of meaningless calculations because the economic models are so ridiculous that they don't tell you anything. But the effect on polarization is very plausible, and in fact held with near unanimity. Even the most fervent advocates of NAFTA conceded that it's going to have this effect of harming semi-skilled workers, which again, I stress, means about 70 or 75% of the workforce, and other losers like women, blacks, Hispanics, and other kind of minor elements like that. That's one reason why NAFTA became a matter of such significance to the political class and the propaganda system and their articulate spokespersons. Incidentally, what's the effect that's expected in Mexico? Interestingly, exactly the same. It's expected that the impact on Mexico will be structurally the same, although probably more drastic because it's a weaker economy. There will be sectors that will gain, multinationals, which have Mexican bases, the people involved in them, corporate lawyers, investors, banks, and so on. They're likely to gain, just as in the United States, but there are many fewer of them, so there'll be less of a gain. And the losers are expected to be the workforce and the peasantry, fairly substantial losers, in fact. The leading financial journal in Mexico, which is very pro-NAFTA, estimated that Mexico would lose about 25% of its manufacturing industry within the first 2 years and about 15% of its workforce. Other analyses estimate that millions of peasants will be driven, it's happening anyway, but millions more peasants will be driven off the land by cheap agricultural exports from US agribusiness. The net effect of this is to swell enormously the unemployed, reserve army in Mexico, which naturally means driving down wages. It's obvious. There's no way to counter that in Mexico because union organizing ranges from difficult to impossible. There were enormous protests in Mexico, not reported here, against the agreement, mainly because Mexican workers and peasants guessed, and others, that the purpose and the effect of NAFTA would be to erode or destroy the constitutional guarantees for workers' rights and educational rights and so on. Those guarantees are significant. They're not always implemented, in fact, far from implemented, but the achievement of them was significant, and to eliminate them would be a major victory for transnational power. So the strong likelihood is that both in Mexico and the United States, and of course in Canada, the agreement will increase the polarization, perhaps sharply, that's been taking place anyway. Inequality has been growing in the United States for the past 30 years. Real wages have been declining since about late 60s. They even began to decline for people with college education during the Reagan years. The society is breaking up into two elements, a wealthy, privileged sector and a superfluous sector of people who are useless for wealth production and profit production, which is, of course, the only value, the only human value, people having no human value in themselves apart from this under dominant ideologies. And the agreement is likely to drive all three countries into a low-wage, low-growth equilibrium in which the population will suffer, but profits will increase. Actually, that's a very broadly held conclusion. It was the conclusion, for example, of the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment in an analysis of this version of NAFTA about a year ago, and I think it's quite a reasonable analysis, and indeed rather widely held. There's a still more important aspect to this version of NAFTA, which kind of explains, I think, the hysteria about it. It's a tremendous attack against democracy, and that's also recognized. You read over and over again that the point of NAFTA is to lock Mexico in to the current reforms, as they are called. That is, the policies of opening up the economy, which have brought about the Mexican economic miracle, in which, incidentally, wages have dropped about 60% over the past decade, and the share of labor in income has dropped from about 36% to 23%. That's a typical reaction, a consequence of structural adjustment, economic liberalization, and so on. And it's necessary to lock that in for Mexico for reasons which, in fact, were described in a high-level Latin American strategy conference in Washington a couple of years ago, which discussed the special relationship between the United States and Mexico and found it extraordinarily positive, completely untroubled by endemic torture and murder of union leaders and the great decline in real wages, starvation, and so on. So the relationship was fine, but there was a cloud on the horizon, and that was this. A democracy opening in Mexico could test the special relationship by bringing into office a government more interested in challenging the United States on economic and nationalist grounds. In other words, you can't be sure that there might not be a democracy opening in Mexico. And if you have a democracy opening, maybe the rabble will start to express their views and interests, and they may challenge this nice arrangement, and then we'd really be in trouble. So therefore, you better lock it in with agreements of roughly the status of a treaty, which are going to be hard to break out of. Incidentally, the same comment holds of the United States and Canada. There have been great achievements by corporate power, increasingly transnational power, in beating down wages and benefits and welfare and converting the state to a kind of a welfare system for the rich even more than before. And it's very important to lock all that stuff in case there might be a democracy opening here too someday. And the fear over such a democracy opening is exactly what inspired all of this hysteria about the labor movement daring to petition its representatives and so on. Well, that's, I should say that this is all built into the mechanisms of these international agreements. And it's not something to speculate about. There are perfectly clear examples already. So take, say, the Canadian-US aspect of it, which already illustrates what's coming and why corporate power and privilege is so committed to this. Here's one example of the kind of thing we might look forward to. There are many. The province of Ontario, there is a so-called free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. The province of Ontario, in Ontario, legislation was proposed to institute a no-fault, publicly funded insurance plan for auto insurance. That would be much cheaper and much more efficient than the current privately supported plan. The situation is analogous to the health system. It would be a system like the health system. You cut back a ton of bureaucracy and administrative costs, it becomes more efficient, and it's also tax-based rather than individually funded, so it's not so regressive and so on. Well, that didn't get very far. It was challenged by US insurance companies who claimed that it was an illegal interference with free trade because it undercut their abilities to operate profitably in Canada. Well, the province of Ontario could have proceeded with litigation on this matter, but they dropped it. It would have been much too expensive, and the insurance companies have the money and the time and the fancy lawyers and so on. The public doesn't. So Ontario dropped it. If it had gone through the procedures specified by the Free Trade Agreement, it would have worked its way up to an adjudication panel, which operates in secret and is made up of corporate lawyers and trade representatives. And you can have a fair guess what the outcome of that will be. But and that's typical. The point is to take away power from popular organizations, even parliamentary organizations, which are somewhat responsive to the public, remove power from them, transfer it to the corporations themselves and their representatives, which a corporation, in particular a transnational corporation, is basically a totalitarian system. Huge, incidentally. Many of them are bigger than most states. It's totalitarian in the sense that the decision-making is completely top-down and no influence from the outside. If it's transnational, even the limited influence that comes from national legislation is restricted. If power can be transferred into their hands, we have an attack on democracy which is really efficient. It means that major decisions affecting our lives will be made in secret by completely unaccountable structures, huge in scale, like they dominate about maybe 40% or so of world trade, so-called. It's 50% of US exports to Mexico don't even enter the Mexican market. They happen to cross the border, but they're from one branch of a US corporation to another, then they come right back again. So these are huge outfits, unaccountable, absolutist in character. If power can be transmitted into their hands, then the residues of the democratic system become more and more meaningless. And that's very important. As I mentioned, the idea of popular democracy, of the mob and the rabble getting involved in public affairs, has always been anathema to privileged sectors. And here we have new opportunities for putting an end to this heresy forever while maintaining formal procedures. You know, like you go every once in a while to, you know, push a lever here and there. Well, you can see that it really is a matter of great significance, not so much because of job loss or gain, nobody knows anything about that, but because of the contribution to polarization and the destructive effects on popular democracy. Those are serious matters, hence the enormous hysteria. I might say that the next major achievement of the Clinton administration, the one, you know, which we could have talked about if this talk was a little later, namely the health plan, has pretty much the same properties. The range of health plans considered in the United States, ranging from, you know, Clinton's managed care over to several options further to the right, they have two crucial properties which are required for a system, for a society that is business run, and business run by a highly class conscious and very powerful business community. One, they're all radically regressive. Unlike every other industrial society, all the plans being considered here are soak the poor plans. A tax-based plan, for example, is as progressive as a tax system. A wage-based plan, at least, you know, you pay more if you get higher wages. Not very progressive, but, you know, at least not flat. The US plans all are flat. In fact, it's probably going to turn out that the CEO pays less than the guy who empties his wastebasket because he has fancier lawyers to figure out how to get tax deductions and so on. So these are, at best, absolutely flat, meaning radically regressive plans, soak the poor plans of a kind unknown in other industrial societies. And that's a fact about these plans that's almost never mentioned. In fact, you do a research project and try to find out how many references you can find to that rather significant fact in the extensive discussion in the media about the health plan. And the second element, which in fact is discussed, is that all these plans place major control in the hands of insurance companies. And that means half dozen huge insurance companies. Hillary Clinton was on television a couple of weeks ago denouncing insurance companies, but if you looked closely, you'll notice that the insurance companies that she was denouncing were the small insurance companies, the ones that are going to be wiped out by these plans. The big insurance companies were notably quiet, kind of applauding quietly in the background, because they're the ones who are going to be the gainers. Incidentally, the Wall Street Journal noticed this and pointed out that Clinton is typical of Democrats in that his real commitments are to big business, not to the entire business community. In this respect, the Democrats are somewhat different from the Republicans, who are just the business party, you know. But the Democrats have a kind of more nuanced attitude toward the business community. This is one of the numerous respects in which they mention that Clinton is a particularly good friend to big business. That's the health program. Notice again, it's going to have the same kinds of social effects as well. And of course, to have the insurance companies run it means that the public pays the enormous costs of an insurance company-based program. That means folks like us are going to pay for the big executive salaries, like the $23 million annual salary of the CEO of Aetna. They'll pay for the profits of the insurance companies, which are enormous, pay for their advertising costs, which are enormous, and all the other corporate prerogatives. And they'll also pay the huge administrative costs, because the insurance companies are going to make very sure that they micromanage doctors to guarantee that they don't give any more health care than the companies can possibly get away with. And then the government's going to have another big bureaucracy monitoring the insurance companies to, you know, just so they don't totally run away with the store. And all of that is going to be costs added on. And those are all required for the healthcare system. Well, what about public opinion on all these matters? That's interesting. In the case of NAFTA, in all three countries, United States, Mexico, and Canada, public opinion was opposed. In Canada, overwhelmingly opposed. In the United States, it was running pretty steadily at about 60% opposition among the part of the public who had a point of view, which is kind of intriguing, since the propaganda was about 100% in favor, and in fact enthusiastically in favor. In Mexico, the latest polls that were taken showed 47% pro-NAFTA. I don't exactly know what the polls mean, like how much did they poll peasants and unemployed workers and so on. Anyway, general opposition in all three countries. And the health care, it's exactly the same. Polls have been taken on health in the United States for about 40 years now, and one consistent feature of them is that either absolute majorities or considerable pluralities have been in favor of the kind of healthcare system that you have in every other industrial country. Some version of a national healthcare system, either tax-based or something similar. The latest polls are running about 60 or 70% in favor of that, although it's off the agenda. All discussion is about other proposals. Now, sometimes in paragraph 26, you'll see a reference to the fact that the public is in favor of what's here called a Canadian-style plan, basically the kind they have elsewhere. But there's a technical term to eliminate this irrelevance. It's called politically unrealistic. That means it's only the public who wants it, not the big corporations and the wealthy and so on. So therefore, it's politically unrealistic and therefore off the spectrum. It's only advocated by that crude, threatening mob, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders and so on. Well, NAFTA, again, is going to contribute to polarization, which means it's a major social engineering project. It's actually part of a major social engineering project, which is contributing to polarization of the society, actually across the world by now. It's an international phenomenon, coming back to the industrial countries. This marginalization of large sectors, possibly even a majority of the population, has consequences. It leads to social disintegration, to breakdown of social of families, of social relations, and so on. It leads to violence and abuse. It leads to an enormous amount of crime. And therefore, it is not in the least surprising, in fact, rather symbolic, that a couple of days after the NAFTA agreement was passed, the Senate passed a huge anti-crime package. Well, that makes sense, too. If you're going to create social disintegration, you better figure out a way to control it. And how do you control it? Well, take a look at the crime package, which also won enormous praise, I should say. Senator Orrin Hatch, for example, described it as the finest anti-crime bill in history. That's real praise for Bill Clinton. It added 100,000 more police, new federal prisons. I think it was a six-fold increase in federal funding of repressive institutions, security forces, in effect, in 52 new federal crimes that get the death penalty. It becomes a crime to be a member of a street gang, so-called, and on and on. A highly repressive package, very reasonable. If social engineering projects are leading to the disintegration of society and the breakdown of social norms and marginalization of people, there's only two answers. Either you change the social policies, but that would harm the wealthy and the privileged, or else you figure out better ways to control and suppress them. So you turn to an anti-crime bill. So it came just at the right time. Let's quickly go back to the announcement of the vision back in late September. The announcement of the vision had three major components. There was a White House intervention panel. There was a international economic policy announced, and then the intellectual foundations of the new vision were explained by the National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake. That was all in a couple of days of late September. The intervention panel concluded that from now on we would not, it said in effect that the age of altruism is over. So we're not going to be nice guys anymore in intervention. I don't have to waste time on describing what happened when we were nice guys. Anyway, that's over. Now intervention is to be guided by the principle, what's in it for us? Okay? Those were the words, in fact, that the New York Times highlighted in describing the panel. So no more nice guy. From now on, it's what's in it for us. That's the intervention panel. The economic panel, the export strategy that was announced, stated, well, I mean, it was sort of encapsulated rather nicely by the Secretary of Treasury, Lloyd Benson, who said, I'm tired of this level playing field business. From now on, we're going to have the playing field tilted in favor of American business. Okay, so the Reagan administration was breaking records, actually, in violating free trade agreements, like so-called free trade agreements like GATT, and in introducing protection. They, in fact, approximately doubled the percentage of imports subject to one or another form of protection. James Baker, when he was Secretary of Treasury, proudly announced to the business community that the Reagan administration had been more protectionist, had been more radical in violating market principles than all post-war administrations combined, which was quite true. It's left to the intellectuals to produce odes to our devotion to the free market. This is important stuff, no time for that. But the Clinton panel announced that that wasn't enough. They were going to go beyond the sporadic and sort of random violations of GATT and other agreements by the Reaganites, and they were going to do it in a more systematic way with huge export-import bank loans to force other countries to purchase U.S. exports and other such measures, which are recognized to be in violation of GATT and to be market distorting, but you know, we've got to tilt the playing field even more in favor of U.S. corporations than before. Well, that was the second element of the new strategy. And the third element, Anthony Lake said that we're going to go from containment to enlargement. In the past, we had been containing threats to democracies, as for example in Iran and Guatemala and Dominican Republic and Chile, and you can go on and add the rest. So that's when we were containing threats to democracy. And now we're going to enlarge what we've been doing before. And all of this was parroted without question by what must be the most servile intellectual class in the world. Raised no question about how we'd been containing threats to democracy, for example, when we overthrew the parliamentary government of Brazil and installed a bunch of neo-fascist monsters, and on and on. Well, anyhow, we're going to enlarge what we've been doing in the past, not be limited to what we've succeeded in doing, so there are a lot of ways that you could proceed. In the last 30 years, the gap between the richest and the poorest countries has doubled. Back around 1960, it was about 30 to 1, the 20% richest and 20% poorest. The gap was about 30 to 1. It's gone up to about 60 to 1, thanks to a combination of protectionist policies in the rich countries, which have become much more protectionist in recent years, and liberalization for the poor countries, which has, you know, the effects of imposing market discipline, highly destructive. Those figures themselves, however, are highly misleading, because if you take the same UN figures and you look at the top 20% of people, not countries, but you know, the top 20% of people in wealth and the bottom 20% in wealth, the gap has in fact extended to 140 to 1. So it's far greater than the gap between the richer nations and the poorer nations, which means the gaps are primarily, about half of them are internal to each society. These are the polarizing tendencies that we have been witnessing here as well, and which are highly praised by the business press. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal had a very enthusiastic article about a month ago describing what they called a welcome development of transcendent importance, namely, wages in the United States had sunk to below any industrial country, except for England, which had done even better in beating down the working class and the poor. We hadn't yet made it to South Korea and Taiwan, and Papua New Guinea was still a couple of steps beyond. But that's another way in which we can enlarge the vision as we proceed into the future, and new policies are in fact designed for that. It's now reached a point, I mean, these have a lowering effect on everyone, notice. In an era where productive labor can be transferred to high repression, low wage areas very easily, in an era of internationalization of production and finance, it's very easy. The lowering of wages in one place has an automatic effect of lowering them everywhere. So lowering Mexican wages will lower US wages, lowering US wages, lowering German wages. Italy, for example, has wages 20% higher than the United States. Just think what that means for a minute. The United States is the richest country in the world with just unparalleled advantages. Okay, now Italy has higher wages. Germany has wages about 60% higher, so naturally German corporations are going to shift their, say, production of luxury cars to places like Alabama, basically no union state, where they can get workers under what amounts to kind of third world conditions, which lowers wages in Germany. The end of the Cold War returns Eastern Europe to its third world status. That's pretty much what the Cold War was about, in my opinion, offering new opportunities, vast new opportunities for Western investors to attack their own populations by using this extremely cheap and highly skilled and educated labor force, maybe about 15% the costs of Western workers, to undermine what the financial press calls the pampered Western European workers and their luxurious lifestyles. In the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and elsewhere, we read about how workers and unions are going to have to understand that the era of affluence and easy life and secure jobs and so on is over. That's a thing of the past. Notice that bosses and investors don't have to understand anything of the kind. What they understand is that the era of greater profits is coming, because that's the consequence as international society becomes polarized. And furthermore, that these systems of absolute power that they run will have more and more control over decisions in international society. That's what they're supposed to understand. Well, one can readily comprehend the great enthusiasm that's been generated about the Clinton vision and the general mood of triumphalism among the victors in this society, which includes wealthy sectors across the world. If you ask who the victors in the Cold War were, it wasn't the West, and it wasn't that the losers were in the East. In fact, the old Communist Party hierarchy in the East are among the victors. They're doing fine. In fact, this is what's sometimes called nomenclatura capitalism. The old political leadership is now the sector that's running the local mafia or working for Western businesses and so on. They're wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The people of those countries are suffering as they're driven back to the third world. In the West, the investors and managers who can shift production to cheap labor areas in the East, they're doing fine. The workers in the West certainly didn't win from this. In fact, they're losing from it. And what you have is a set of victors and losers that are cross-national and that are defined by very clear class interests. The same was true after the Second World War, where it's just incorrect to say that the victors were the Allies and the losers were the fascists. That didn't happen at all. The big industrialists who were in Nazi Germany and Italy and Japan were put right back into power. In fact, ended up being wealthier than before. They were among the victors. Their own populations, including the anti-fascist resistance, they were the losers. And similar things happen in the West. And that's, in fact, what we're seeing now with the end of the Cold War. And for people like us, all of this is quite important. US power is at historic heights in many respects, including the ideology that goes along with it. The ideology of which the basic tenet is that human beings have value exactly insofar as they contribute to profit making. They have no intrinsic value. They're useless and meaningless objects if they do not contribute to this purpose. You control them or suppress them in some fashion. That's another ideological victory and another increase in US power. And this increase in power has a consequence. It means that our capacity to change the world increases accordingly. That's true for all American citizens. Along with it, our responsibility to make use of that capacity.